Hi, welcome to this month's, I guess you could say, group of teachings. We're continuing our discussion of Rob Bell's book, Love Wins. I highly recommend Francis Chan's book, Erasing Hell. What I like about that book is it's a very humble position that Francis approaches this subject with, but there's a lot of scholarly references and resources that he lists so that you can do your own research into what he's saying, and it just provides that amount of, I don't know how you say it because the word should be enough, but in our society where we're very cranial in our thinking, intellect, and the mind is elevated, unfortunately, to a rather large degree. Not saying that we should be mindless, but we like our proof, I guess you could say. And so he gives a lot of really good resources to back up his response to the book Love Wins. And so I'm bringing those together. To be honest, this journey through Rob Bell's book has been difficult. In the way I mean difficult is that truth is a person. Pilate said, "What is truth?" And he asked Jesus Christ, who as a person was standing before him as truth, and he missed it. And I feel like that's what this book is about. That yes, God is a God of love, but he is also one of truth, and those that love the truth hear what truth is saying. And there's just so much in this book that is not truth, and it's not scriptural, that it's almost overwhelming, and it's kind of like digging around in the mud. And I would rather be talking about other things, to be honest. But so just to reiterate, Rob Bell's book is the premise of his book is, of all the billions of people who have ever lived, will only a select number make it to a better place, and every other single person suffer in torment and punishment forever. Is this acceptable to God? Has God created millions of people over tens of thousands of years who are going to spend eternity in anguish? Can God do this, or even allow this, and still claim to be a loving God? This question in itself is so messed up. You could spend hours discussing the things in it, but the main thing is that a God of love forever changed his form and became man. And that was because he was driven by love to rescue us. And this question almost like points to God, like God created all these people. It's not fair that he would create these people and yet they would burn forever in anguish. But the fact is that man chose to not believe God. Man made that decision, not God. And it really is a matter of your identity. Are you born from above with a new nature that looks like Christ, and you're now part of his family? Or are you still part of the old kingdom that is ruled by Satan, who is the ruler of this world system? Is he your dad? Really, like I just told a lady, who is your daddy? It's not whether you do good, it's not whether you do bad, it is who is your dad. And that's the question. Do you believe in Jesus Christ? If so, your Father is the Father in heaven. If you refuse to believe him, he can't rescue you. He won't go against your choice, and so your Father remains the one that rules this world system. So, that's just one of the things that's wrong with his question. But, it's one that people ask. How is that fair? And then he says, does God punish people for thousands of years with infinite, eternal torment for things they did in their few years of finite life? And again, it's not so much what you do, it's who you are. That's what determines where you go for eternity. And so basically the age-old question of, can a living God send people to hell? And so we're to chapter 3 in his book, which is titled Hell. And it reminded me of a conversation I had years ago. I was a new believer, and I didn't know the ins and outs of the Bible and theology and stuff like that. I just knew that I was a sinner. And I knew I was a sinner. There was no doubt. And I was saved. And that's all I knew, was that he loved me and he saved me. And so I was ill-equipped for the conversation that I had with my friend's boyfriend. And he said he was a believer, but to my astonishment, he didn't believe there was a hell. Well, to me, who had just been born again and understood that fear of punishment, which John says perfect love or complete love casts out the fear of punishment. But living with that fear of punishment was relieved because I was saved. And my perspective was that God loved me enough to save me, not God is love so he wouldn't punish. I didn't even picture God punishing, actually. I just pictured that my choice could have meant eternal, living in hell, basically. And so I didn't even tie it to God doing it. I just felt I had a decision to make. And so that was pretty much all I knew. I mean, I was barely, a few months old. And so he said he didn't believe there was a hell. And then I'm like, well, do you believe there's a heaven? He said, well, of course. And so even in my limited knowledge, I'm thinking, well, so if there's a heaven, but you say there's no hell, then that means you're kind of picking and choosing only the good parts. And it didn't feel right to me. And so then I'm like, well, where do all the people that kill each other and molest little children and stuff, where do they go? If they don't get saved, where do they go? Because they can't go into heaven, because God's not going to allow people like that into heaven. So what do we do with all of them? And he couldn't answer me, but I remember feeling this helpless feeling of, how can you say you're a Christian and yet not believe the Bible? How can you say you're a Christian and explain away things that to me made a lot of sense? And I really forgot about that question until this week, preparing for this video series. And so basically this guy let me know that he just believed that the Bible was just a bunch of stories. So then I'm like, oh, so they're fake, stories, fictional stories that have a good lesson to be learned, but you believe there's a heaven. Well, how can that be? Because if they're stories, then wouldn't heaven just be a story? And if that's the case, why even bother? You know what I mean? Why should we even bother to be productive citizens on this earth if there's no reward system? And what's the deterrent if there's no system that punishes evil? And so if we as humans recognize that some people need to be put in prison, why wouldn't God recognize that some have to be put in prison away from his family? So it didn't make a lot of sense to me. And you'll notice in this book, Love Wins, that a lot of the stories are relegated, or a lot of the Bible is relegated to just a story. And that's an underlying theme. And some are stories, but not everything that's in there is. And so I don't think we can pick and choose which is fake and what is real. And I'm only going to pick the good parts, but I'm not going to mess with the bad parts that I don't like. We have to accept God in everything that he is. The lion, the lamb, the judge, the savior, all of that.